Friends, I want to talk about an important matter that is sobering, and yet I don't know that we can continue to avoid it. And maybe some of us are talking about it, and more of us need to be. But I want to talk about the need to tell the truth in a culture of lies. Because lies in our culture and even in the church have become incessant and obvious. And we need to ask ourselves, why do we even continue as believers and as the larger public to tolerate or even embrace them? There's something I've talked about often from a psychological perspective called cognitive dissonance, the work of Leon Festinger, 1957-58, on the theory of cognitive dissonance, tells us that humans naturally avoid internal discomfort when their beliefs are challenged. And so when people have invested their identity, their trust, their hope in a leader or a movement, admitting deception creates painful cognitive dissonance. And to avoid that internal distress, what we often do is double down rather than face the truth. Why? Because we prefer comfort over truth. So rather than revise our beliefs, we often ignore or rationalize obvious falsehoods in order to maintain emotional security. Now, ultimately, that fails and we collapse under it at some point. But the reality is, that's one of the reasons we do what we do. Another reason is the issue of identity and tribalism, the us versus them mentality that's become pervasive in the church and in the culture. We often identify strongly with groups and leaders, creating deep emotional bonds. Loyalty to our tribe can often override facts, evidence, and truth. Why? Because we could say belonging overcomes accuracy. Tribal loyalty frequently leads us to overlook clear lies, precisely because acknowledging truth would mean losing community, belonging, and identity. Then there's the normalization of falsehood that leads to fatigue and desensitization. When the lies we hear are continuous and overwhelming, we become numb and desensitized. That constant flood of deception leads to fatigue, leads to apathy. We could say it this way: then everything seems a lie, truth becomes indistinguishable. Eventually, we stop actively discerning between the true and the false, and we accept lies as normal or unavoidable. On top of that, all of that is reinforced through social media and our echo chambers. We live in a digital age, and in the digital age, media can reinforce often and frequently lies on a constant basis, creating closed information ecosystems. Why? Because echo chambers amplify deception. When we primarily consume information from sources that confirm our pre-existing views, even obvious falsehoods seem believable. We're also afraid of humiliation and shame. Admitting we've been deceived, especially publicly, feels humiliating. Many of us avoid acknowledging lies out of fear of embarrassment or shame. Why? Because it's easier to stay wrong than admit we've been fooled. Our personal pride prevents many of us from publicly acknowledging deception, even when privately troubled by those obvious lies. We also have a desire for certainty, and we want our leaders to be strong, because during unstable times, we gravitate toward strong personalities, even if they're flawed or deceptive, because certainty and strength become more appealing than nuance or truth. We could say it this way: when we feel insecure, clarity, real or false, feels comforting. Obvious deception can be tolerated if the leader provides emotional security, purpose, or clarity in uncertain times. Gradual acceptance becomes a really slippery slope, though. Lies repeated consistently gradually become believable. History shows how totalitarian regimes and propaganda machines use repetition to erode resistance to deception. Joseph Goebbels, one of the major supporters and leaders in the Hitler regime, said a lie repeated often enough becomes the truth. So the gradual acceptance of small lies eventually conditions us to accept larger and more blatant lies. So then the question I would ask is, how does public opinion finally shift? Well, despite all those powerful dynamics, history does reveal that sustained deception rarely lasts indefinitely. Eventually, reality shows up. Undeniable consequences become visible. Lies, because the way they are what they are, directly impact our lives, financially, physically, and emotionally. Internal contradictions and infighting expose hidden truths. And influential figures that publicly acknowledge their deception cause that house of cards to crumble before our eyes. All of those tipping points provoke sudden and dramatic shifts in public sentiment, and it often results in widespread disillusionment, anger, and even humiliation. So, as someone who has spent 50 years in pastoral ministry, wrestling with ethical responsibility, I would say to my fellow pastors and mentors and thoughtful leaders that our calling isn't merely to lament the tolerance of lies. It's to embody truth-telling clearly and compassionately. It's to understand the deep human vulnerabilities that lies exploit. It's to offer patient compassion and humility to those caught in deception. And it's to be prepared to help people when the lies inevitably collapse. The public continues to tolerate obvious lying because of deep psychological, social, and spiritual factors: identity, tribalism, fatigue, fear, comfort. However, history consistently demonstrates that truth eventually breaks through. So our responsibility remains clear. We need to speak truth patiently and courageously. We need to show compassion and recognize human vulnerabilities. We need to prepare spiritually and emotionally for the inevitable moment of awakening and healing. This is how we hold steady in the midst of incessant deception, grounded in realism, humility, and genuine, godly compassion.